Hi, everyone. I'm Barbara Slavin, and I direct the Middle East Perspectives Project here at the Stimson Center. We're delighted to welcome you. We have a great treat. It is an honor to welcome General Frank McKenzie. His 42-year career in the Marine Corps began in 1979, which was a pivotal year in the Middle East. And it ended in April of 2022, not long after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. He's written a really excellent new book, The Melting Point, High Command and War in the 21st Century, in which he reflects on his career and in particular the 3 years that he spent at the head of Central Command, CENTCOM, from 2019 to 2022. So again, General, welcome to Stimson. We share a profound interest, some might even call it an obsession, with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And in your book, you refer to Iran as the core problem that you faced at Central Command. You've obviously studied Iran deeply. I was struck by your knowledge of Iranian history. You write, Iran is a genuine, legitimate hegemon in its region, and to deny or minimize the existence of this history is to ignore the basic facts of the geostrategic situation. So much of U.S. policy toward the Middle East, certainly over the last 4 decades since the Iranian Revolution, has focused on containing, deterring, or confronting Iran. So I guess I'll begin with a kind of broad question, and that is, what have we gotten right? What have we gotten wrong over that period of history? Is there a way to reduce this enmity for the benefit of the U.S., Iran, and the entire region? And how have our own actions, U.S. actions, and the ongoing Gaza war made it more difficult to reduce tensions? So a big question to start, and then we'll go into some specifics.
Sure. So let me begin by observing that I think Iran today, the Iranians see themselves as a revolutionary state. They believe that the revolution of the late 70s fundamentally changed the direction of the country in many ways. And I do still hold to the assertion that Iran's an ancient civilization going back a long time. But this particular characteristic of government that we see now in Iran is very dangerous for the region and very dangerous for all their neighbors. So I want to be very clear about that. The problem here is Iran. It's not U.S. activity. It's not others. It's Iran. And it begins and ends with them. However, if we're going to examine Iran, I would argue that once you accept the fact they're revolutionary, they see themselves as a revolutionary people, then they face the challenge, and they are smart, and they know history. They recognize that as the revolutionary generation exits the stage, it's always hard to keep the revolution on track. You have the example of the Russian Revolution, you have the example of the French Revolution and others, where those revolutions ended up in very different places than the revolutionaries themselves envisioned when it actually happened. So given that, that's why the beginning and end point of Iranian policy, I would argue, is preservation of the regime. Preservation in particular of the theocratic regime that sits on top with all of the problems that poses for the region, but that nonetheless is their highest priority. Now, I would argue Iran also pursues 2 other priorities. One priority is the destruction of the state of Israel. We should take them at their word when they say that's important to them. And the second one is the ejection of the United States from the region for a lot of reasons that go back many decades, but also some pressing operational reasons for Iran today. So objectives 2 and 3 sometimes flip-flop. They might operate against us more than Israel at a given time, but never at any time does it challenge objective 1, which is preservation of the regime. So all Iranian action, I would say, you can actually observe and deduce rational behavior on the Iranians' part when it comes to preservation of that first and highest objective. And I think we see that. I don't think, for example, that's one of the reasons Iran chose not to actually go into in any great degree of support for Hamas in Gaza. Certainly they agree with the objectives of Hamas. Certainly they're happy to see that Israel is in Gaza and struggling there. All this is good news to Iran, but they chose not to actually give significant other support to Hamas in this fight. And I think that's a very important thing because they ultimately respect the capability of the State of Israel and what it could bring to them and what that might mean for other relationships in the region. So understanding that, and I would also say that the recent exchange with Israel in April had nothing to do with what was going on in Gaza. Rather, it was a reaction to the fact that over the past few years, in the last year and a half, 2 years in particular, Israel has outfought Iran in the shadow war that's been fought around the theater, culminating in the 1 April strike against IRGC planners in Damascus. As a result of that, Iran felt that they had to act back. They had to do something to try to reset the table. And I would further argue the Iranians took a page from the Russian playbook, escalate to de-escalate. Right. If you don't like the terms of the engagement, do something violent and dramatic that will cause your opponent to sit back and recalculate. Do they really want to be in the game at this level? The problem is they're not the Russians, and they don't have a nuclear card to play. The Russians always can fall back on that when they escalate to de-escalate, and we've seen a little bit of that in Ukraine. So what they instead did was attack Israel with their ballistic missiles, their drones, and their land attack cruise missiles, a capability that I would argue is the actual crown jewel of Iranian deterrence. I would argue functionally it is more important than a possible nuclear weapon, and we can talk about their pursuit of nuclear weapons here in a moment. But I think their ability to deliver overmatched combat power, which is more combat power than the defender can absorb, in their opinion anyway, was the most important thing about their deterrence capability. So they launched a massive attack on Israel. And for those who would say, well, it wasn't a massive attack, it was a massive attack. Iran probably has today 1,000 missiles that can range Israel. Mm-hmm. They can't fire them all at once. They have to put them on tractor, erector launchers, what we call TELs. They got, for the sake of argument, say 100 to 200 of those. They used all those. They got to take the missiles out of storage, you got to fire them. But that limits your salvo rate. You got to go back and reload your missiles. So what we saw was about the most Iran could throw at Israel. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem is the attack failed. It failed for a variety of reasons. First of all, good Israeli defenses. Second, that the Arab neighbors helped. We helped. And then the Iranians had a surprising and disappointing, for them at least, failure rate in their ballistic missiles, approaching, according to some reports, 50% between launch and breakup in flight. So that attack failed, and as a result, I would argue, challenges regime stability just a little bit. Mm. And so the Israeli response a week later, I was worried that the Israeli response would be heavy-handed. They were going to go, what I would say, go downtown in Tehran, kill a bunch of people, which they have the capability to do. Instead, they had a very nuanced, very adept response where the Iranians, I believe, as we speak right now, they're not sure what happened, except that somebody was flying over Iranian territory in the middle of the night. Some targets were struck near a nuclear facility. Different types of platforms may have been involved, but they're just not sure. So what that did for the Israelis was, first of all, demonstrate, yes, we still have continued technological superiority over you, and we can come back tomorrow night if we want to, and the night after. Yeah. And on the other hand, what they did not do was push a wedge against the Arab nations that stood with them in this defense, and a wedge against the United States, who feared the Israeli attack would be over the top. Yeah.
Also, I mean, look, the Israelis had a lot of help in shooting down almost all those drones and missiles. Iran doesn't have that kind of help, which is, I think, something something to be aware of.
That is absolutely correct.
You write a lot in your book about the summer of 2019, which was a fateful summer in many ways. One of the things that struck me was your reference to the decision by President Trump not to retaliate when the Iranians shot down an American drone. And you said that had the U.S. responded then, and had Trump not called off that strike, that that might have been an escalation to de-escalate, and that Qassem Soleimani might still be alive today. I thought that was quite interesting.
I think we missed an opportunity. So what happened in brief was, in the middle of July 2019, the Iranians shot down an RQ-4 drone. It's a high-flying Navy jet drone flying at 40,000 feet. We now know it was a low-level commander that took that action without clearance from headquarters. As often happens in the Iranian system, low-level commanders take charge and behave very aggressively. They shot it down, and we were looking to respond. And the response that we recommended and that was pushed up through the Secretary of Defense was to strike some targets on the Iranian coast. And we were confident, at a very, very high degree of confidence, there would have been few or no casualties in that attack. And unfortunately, when I got over to the White House, someone over there in the National Security Staff told the President, we're going to kill 150 Iranians. There's no basis for that. That's just not true. So I can't blame the President for the decision he made, because I would not have recommended a strike that was going to kill 150 people because no American lives were lost. So it was not. It would have been disproportionate. Right. So it was a mistake. It was not his mistake. It was a mistake of his national security staff, who and probably his lawyers who used a different collateral damage calculation mechanism that was flawed and wrong. Whatever. We didn't do it. So the Iranians, again, they follow Lenin's dictum: you stick the bayonet in. If you reach mush, you keep pushing. If you reach steel, you pull it out. We had an opportunity then to modify Iranian behavior, but we did not do it. We did some low-level cyber stuff, I believe, that they may or may not have noticed. And but as a result, the escalatory spiral that took us to the second half of the year continued.
Now, there was the attack on Abqaiq,
yes,
on the Saudi oil
that's
facility.
Correct.
Now, did the Saudis not ask us to respond to that?
So, first of all, for a while, difficult to know where the attack came from. Houthis raised their hands and said it was us. It wasn't the Houthis, it was the Iranians, although I don't believe to this day Iran has actually ever claimed responsibility for that attack.
But from southern Iraq, according to some accounts.
I think what the Iranians did was they launched from western Iran and they routed their drones in the upper reaches of the Arabian Gulf and then back down around to the south, which avoided Saudi radars. So clever, very clever. And as a result of that, no, we did not strike Iran back. I did not recommend that because no American lives have been lost, not an attack on the United States. Saudi could have chosen to respond if they wanted to. They did not. But what we did do were several things. We put an air expeditionary wing into the old air base at Prince Sultan Air Base, repositioned a big radar, an ANTPY-2, which is a huge battle management radar there, brought in fighters, brought in Patriots, brought in a variety of things, and we activated the Saudi defense plan. So we did a number of things with Saudi Arabia. They were generally, and I note it in the book, and they wanted more, but we gave them quite a bit. But nonetheless, I would argue that attack in September might have been averted had something happened to Iran earlier. But it didn't, so now we see the escalatory spiral beginning because they're pushing, and really nothing's pushing back against them. And that's what leads to events of December and January.
Yeah. Now, I remember that December and January very, very well. And the kind of protests that were taking place around the American embassy in Baghdad, the attacks on Americans that you write about, and of course, right after New Year's, the fateful decision to kill Qassem Soleimani. Who I actually met once, although I didn't know it was him at the time I met him, but that's another story. That was in Iran. And,
did he look like George Clooney?
No one. It was in 2006, and no one knew what he looked like then. It was before he was taking selfies with soldiers in Iraq. But anyway, it's interesting story. I had a lot of doubts about the decision to kill Qassem Soleimani, and I really want to probe you on this because you write in the book that you supported the decision, but you don't convince me. This is part of your book that I just don't find convincing. The reporting at the time suggested that it was an option shown to Trump, but it was sort of the last option, and nobody really wanted or expected him to take it. And you write, quote, "The actual decision to strike Soleimani did not come out of a deliberate planning process. It was a decision made by the president, whose advisors said Iran would not retaliate." So, did you really support this? In hindsight, was it a good idea? Did it diminish Iranian capabilities? I mean, the axis of resistance that Qassem Soleimani helped create looks like it's doing extremely well in the region now. Tell us the truth.
As for the effect of his loss, I would defer to Foreign Minister Zarif, who made the mistake of recording an oral history in Iran, an oral history that people who are not friends of his leaked, and the New York Times ran a significant excerpt from. And in that oral history, he says the death of Qassem Soleimani was a major disaster for us, as significant as losing a major city in Iran. So we can take that or leave it.
But I mean, was it? It was justified at the time saying, he was in charge of fomenting new attacks on Americans. I was told by the Iraqi prime minister at the time that he was coming with an offer from Iran to Saudi Arabia, they were trying to patch up relations in the aftermath of Abqaiq. So, and the protests around the U.S. Embassy had already subsided. That crisis had been averted. So why do we choose that moment to kill him?
So there was clear and compelling evidence that he was coming into Iraq to prepare others to attack the United States, to attack the embassy and other bases in the region. Just as clear as you and I are talking right now.
But it's never been published.
I'm not responsible for publishing that information. I'm responsible for making decisions based on the situation that existed on the ground then. I was very comfortable with the decision to strike Qassem Soleimani that day, that night, and today as we talk. It was the right decision. It had a good effect in the region. But as all things in the region, it's complex. It's not very, it's not unadulterated good, but I believe the risk of inaction in that case was greater than the risk of action. I believe had we not struck him as he entered Baghdad, Americans would have died in the next 24, 72, 96 hours, and other people from other countries might have died as well. And I was convinced by the evidence that the right thing to do was to take that strike. So I'm very comfortable with that strike. Had we not done it, I believe that the world would have been a worse place.
It's theoretical. You can't prove it.
That's right.
The whole notion of assassinating senior
So let's be clear.
officials-
I'm sorry. Assassination is a legal act.
Yeah.
So this was not an illegal act. He was an enemy combatant. The President of the United States has the authority to take that action. So we can use the word. I'm just not going to be able to respond to it. It's not an assassination.
The targeted killing, to use the Israeli phrase, the Israeli euphemism, of so many individuals. This is the sort of thing the Israelis have done historically for a long, long time. Usually, initially in revenge for acts of terrorism, later in so-called preemptive attacks. Many, many Iranian generals. You spoke of the killing of the 7 Iranian IRGC folks in Damascus, which led to the Iranian attack on Israel. The United States typically has not been in the business of killing important officials from adversary governments, at least in my lifetime, which is pretty long. Is this a good idea? I mean, it sets a precedent,
Sure.
right?
So
For them coming after us.
Admiral Yamamoto in World War II might have a different opinion on that because we struck him. He was a legitimate target. I would argue that he was a legitimate target
We
and
were
we struck
at war
him.
with Japan. Are we at war with Iran? We've never had a declaration.
Don't need a declaration of war in order to defend yourself.
Yeah. Is it a good idea to go around knocking off people like that?
I would say in this case it was a very good idea.
I am grateful that you didn't shoot down the civilian airliner that he was on, but yeah. There's another point too. Okay, you kill him, you get replacements. Sometimes the replacements are far more potent, far worse. Look at the Israelis killed the head of Hezbollah in 1992. They got Hassan Nasrallah, who is arguably more powerful now than the supreme leader of Iran in terms of his military control over the region. You kill, I don't know how many heads of Hamas the Israelis have killed. Now they have Yahya Sinwar, who perpetrated the worst attack on Israel ever. Again, you're okay with this? No
I'm okay with killing Qassem Soleimani, and I would argue that his successor is not as effective as him, and their response has been far more fragmented than it would have been had he lived. So in the case I know a little bit about directly, I would have to reject your assertion completely.
Soleimani had a great deal of command and control over all of these various forces. His replacement doesn't. On the one hand, that made him more lethal, but on the other hand, that makes all these groups harder to control.
Yes, it does, and we recognize that at the time we were taking the strike. It makes them more difficult to control, but it also makes them less effective because they can't act cohesively. So there's a trade-off. In any kind of battlefield situation like this, it's a trade-off. It's not a perfect solution. I felt it was the best possible solution at the time. I think it's the case today.
Okay, enough beating a dead horse, or a dead IRGC general anyway. Let's talk a little bit more about CENTCOM and about the perennial efforts to get the GCC countries and now Israel to coordinate their defenses in some realistic and practical way. I've heard talk of Arab NATOs and MISA, was it called, and all these various other acronyms, try to put these countries together, get them to share information and, have compatible systems. Where are we now with that? How much progress have we made? We saw a little bit when the Iranians attacked Israel in terms of sharing of some information, but it still strikes me that they don't trust each other.
Well, if I could use your phrase, Barbara, the Israelis had a lot of help. You said it, not me.
I did.
And so that's actually something I'd like to talk about because when I first went to CENTCOM as General Mattis's J5 back in 2010, one of his objectives was to talk about regional integrated air and missile defense. We saw the rising threat from Iran. It was very clear. The Gulf nations, by and large, though, would not buy into it because they did not see the immediacy of the threat. So what has changed since 2010 to now? First of all, the Iranians have invested massively in those ballistic missiles, in those drones, and in those land attack cruise missiles. Additionally, we've seen the attack on Saudi Arabia that you saw, other attacks in the region. They saw the effectiveness of the Iranian attack at al-Assad, which, while it missed, was nonetheless intended to be a lethal attack and was very accurately delivered. And Iran, in a variety of other ways, has acted aggressively across the region. So the Gulf states have taken notice of that. So I would argue that what happened was, first of all, the Abraham Accord opened the door for diplomatic recognition at some level of Israel in the region. Second, the movement of Israel from European command into Central Command really set the military architecture to allow information to be exchanged, because we always worked aggressively with Israel even while they were in the European command. But nonetheless, it sounds like a bureaucratic thing, but actually it's a little more difficult to do when they're not in your region. So they came into my region. And so what I was able to do, and I can speak about this because the Wall Street Journal leaked it extensively some time ago, in the fall of 2021 and in the spring of 2022, I convened meetings at Sharm el-Sheikh at the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula with chiefs of defense of the region, including the Israeli Chad, the Saudi Chad, other chiefs of defense. And what our topic was the growing threat of Iranian ballistic missile, cruise missile, and the drone threat. And these were not just meetings where we got together, had dinner, took a picture. Hundreds of staff hours of work preceded it. Hundreds of staff hours followed it, where we talked about ways we can share information. So look, all the nations in the region are reasonably suspicious of each other, and not just of Israel, but of each other as well. They all, though, have a good sense of the United States as an honest broker. And the other thing is, if you're going to work with another nation, air and missile defense is something that doesn't require you to give up sovereignty. You don't have to base troops in your country, and base yours in someone else's country. So what you're doing is you're sharing information. You're building what we call a common operational picture. Here's what we see. Here's what the Iranians are doing. And then you can talk about tactics, techniques, and procedures. Now, clearly, Israel benefits from this because they are geographically distant from Iran, and to get to Israel, you've got to overfly some combination of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, and other countries. So it benefits Israel, but it also benefits the other countries in the region because they gain access to the same common operational picture. We talk about ways we can share information. We do it through our Combined Air Operations Center, which reaches out to everyone. Again, the United States remains indispensable in this regard. Everybody trusts us, even if they don't trust each other completely. So with some nations, you have data links, which information passes in milliseconds. With some nations, it's emails, classified emails, and some nations, it's phone calls. Each mode is slower than as we go up the scale here. But nonetheless, what it allows you to do is talk about if Iran delivers this capability that they now view as an imminent threat. If Iran attacks with this capability, we can talk about ways to intercept, we can share data, we can share information, tactics, what we call TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. So I would argue that what we saw in mid-April in the successful defense of Israel was actually a classic, elegant test of that concept, and it worked. Now look, I don't want to overdraw the positive side of it because, again, Israel has geographic advantages. An attack on Saudi Arabia is much closer to Iran, and you won't have the geographic depth that Israel has. But nonetheless, you still get everybody in the region is concerned. Everybody in the region will act to help. So what you get is a community of interest at the mill-to-mill level that I believe is percolating up to the political level. And that's why, in my judgment, I think normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel is going to happen because they've been pushed in that direction by Iran's reckless, irresponsible, malign behavior. And Saudi Arabia has a vision for the future. It's directly threatened by the Iranian ability to strike them. So I'm actually, look, there are a lot of problems in the region. This is actually something where there's good news and a possible path forward.
I was going to ask you about the notion of a formal U.S. defense agreement with the Saudis. As you know, yes, Saudi Arabia has a positive vision for the future, but Mohammed bin Salman is not exactly an uncontroversial figure. His human rights record is poor. He chopped up a friend of mine in a Saudi consulate not long ago, Jamal Khashoggi. He still has people in prison for 35 years for a tweet. He decides what he wants to do, and he does it. Should the United States have a formal defense treaty with a country that is very far from a democracy, doesn't share our values, when, I mean, we have so few of these kinds of agreements. We have NATO, we have agreements with Japan, South Korea, but they're fellow democracies. We don't even have a formal defense agreement with the Israelis. So is it a good idea to have one with Saudi Arabia?
Ultimately, that's a diplomatic question, not a military question. My answer would be, if the United States is going to be a global power and exert power globally, sometimes you're going to have to make common cause with nations that don't necessarily share your values, but might share your interests.
So common cause is one thing, but an agreement to defend them against attack?
Well, let's see what happens, and let's see how it links to normalization of Saudi ties with Israel, because I think you're simplifying the equation a little bit.
It has to include that.
If I were giving advice, I would say it must include Israel. It must include normalization of ties with Israel.
What about providing Saudi Arabia with uranium enrichment facilities?
I think that's a question of civil nuclear power. I think that's certainly something they're going to be taking a look at. I'm not an expert on that. I wouldn't claim to be. I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to it. Saudi is going to have the ability to get to that through other sources as well. Might we not want to work with them on that so we can exert a degree of control over it?
Yeah, all right. I'm going to start to take some questions from the audience. So I think we have a very motivated audience. I'll start with this lady here, and if you would wait for the microphone, and if you don't mind, you can give us your name. Thanks.
Thank you, General. My name is Ragad Al-Sadi, and I am a consultant on counterterrorism and human rights law. My research was on the counterterrorism efforts to defeat ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and the overlap with, or the gaps with, the human rights law, international criminal law, humanitarian law, and refugee law. So it's all relevant to the military efforts to defeat ISIS. But what's
your question? Yeah.
My question is, who is actually benefiting from the existence of ISIS, whether from the very beginning and the operations to defeat ISIS and the resurgence? Because there are 2 points. One is that the U.S. is benefiting from ISIS by having a legitimate existence and presence with that scale in the Middle East. The other point is actually Iran benefiting from ISIS by establishing a large scale in Iraq, the proxies and the al-Hashd.
Okay, I think we have the gist. Let me add on to this. Just a qualification. There was a major ISIS attack in Iran, ISIS-K, at a commemoration for Soleimani. It killed 100 people. So I'm not sure I agree with your analysis, but the U.S. still has forces in Iraq and Syria. Supposedly on a counter-ISIS mission, but as we all know, it's more about Iran maybe even than it is about ISIS.
So not sure I'd agree with that, actually. ISIS in the Euphrates River Valley and in eastern Syria, as well as ISIS-K in Afghanistan, both are very clear in their desire to attack the United States. And we saw ISIS-K deliver a very effective attack in Moscow just a few months ago, too. Yeah. So I would argue that in the Euphrates River Valley, and not directly done by Americans, our troop presence there is about 1,000 soldiers, more or less. I don't know the exact numbers anymore. But the Kurds do most of the work there, the SDF. We're sitting on prisons with about 10,000 hardened ISIS fighters, of which 2,000, I would argue, are particularly dangerous. And if we left, they'd be out. They'd be in the body politic, and that would be very bad. Additionally, significant problems at the IDP camps there. If we left, I think they're bad now. They're going to get a lot worse if we withdraw what protection we have for them now. Additionally, and finally, I would point out that I do believe we keep our boot on the neck of ISIS in that region. It's difficult to plot against attacking Detroit when you're worried about surviving the night. And so that's just an unpleasant, but nonetheless part of the business. And so I would say that there may be effects against Iran that I won't deny by our presence there, but nonetheless, they're good and compelling reasons to be there that involve ISIS. And I'd reject just wholeheartedly the idea that we benefit somehow from ISIS. I mean, the friends I've lost that died as a result of ISIS, I think they would challenge that, and I would too. I think that's quite a reach to believe that, but I understand it. I just don't agree with you.
Let me ask you a broader question about the size of the U.S. presence in the region. How big should it be? Or rather, how low can it go and still perform this function of protecting American interests and those of our friends and partners there?
Sure. So I would argue that our presence in the region needs to be large enough, and it needs to be focused on Iran. And it needs to be large enough so that Iran is deterred from reaching out to try to reset the table the way they did against Israel. And let me give you an example. Let me give you another level of detail on that. An event occurs, an Iranian proxy group attacks a United States element, we respond, and then the Iranians respond again. And what the force presence in the region needs to be at a level that will prevent the second Iranian attack from causing enough casualties to let us go up the escalation ladder. So in effect, we are yet again saving the Iranians from themselves, as we have done on many times. We saved them from themselves at Al-Assad. Possibly the Israelis saved them from themselves in the defense in mid-April.
Yeah.
So I would argue that's how you calculate your presence. So it becomes very complex. What you really need you need naval assets that have ballistic missile defense capabilities and air defense capabilities. You need Patriot systems that have those defense capabilities. You need some fighter aircraft.
Do you need an aircraft carrier there all
So
the time?
I like an aircraft carrier in the region, and the reason I like an aircraft carrier is the constant problem Central Command commanders have is what we call ABO, access, basing, and overflight.
Right.
An aircraft carrier is sovereign United States soil. I can do anything I want with the airplanes that go off that deck. I don't have to coordinate with anybody else. That's United States property. So that gives you significant flexibility, as well as the ability to move the carrier around the theater, which makes it harder for the Iranians to detect and target. They know where our bases are and can target those bases, and as we said a little bit earlier, the Iranians have invested a lot in their ballistic missiles, their drones, and their cruise missiles in order to go after those bases. It's a little harder to go after that carrier.
It's just, I remember hearing the former Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif say once that, how dare Iran put itself between American bases? This was when we were both in the Persian Gulf and we were in Afghanistan. This sense that Iran has that the United States doesn't belong there. Now, countries there have asked us to be present. That's why we're there, right? That's it? Full stop?
No, actually, I think we have interests in the region. There's their economic interests in the region. We have always an interest in the free flow of commerce globally. And a disruption of free flow of commerce anywhere is actually the precedent for disruption everywhere. So we have reasons for being there. Also, I think we've established as a national security objective of the United States that Iran should not possess a nuclear weapon. So that's another reason to be in the region. We have long-standing relationship with Israel that's in there, as you noted, no formal tie, but nonetheless we have agreements with them and agreements that, while not formal, nonetheless extend to other nations in the region. So there are a lot of reasons for the United States to be there.
Yeah, not just that we inherited this burden from the Brits and we're stuck with it.
I don't believe that there's an analog carrying over from the Brits. I think it's very different.
All right. Gentleman there with the cap.
It's good to see you again, General. I'm Augustus Salzono, and what would you say to those who served under your command, including relatives and friends of mine, particularly those who served with honor and distinction in Afghanistan, who are now suffering from PTSD and other wounds of war, that their sacrifice was not made in vain, given the fact that we've lost control of Afghanistan?
Sure. So, first of all, I know and understand their pain. I was not born a four-star general. I went to Afghanistan as a colonel and fought at a tactical level pretty hard. My son went to Afghanistan twice as an infantry lieutenant, a Marine lieutenant, as a rifle platoon commander, and as a mortar platoon commander. So I have a pretty good understanding of what it means to examine the fight in Afghanistan not from the four-star level, But in answer to your question, look, the United States military went to Afghanistan to prevent attacks being generated on the U.S. homeland. To a large degree, we have been successful doing that. Now, over time, the mission in Afghanistan expanded. The United States military didn't do that. That was a national decision made by the United States. But nonetheless, those who went, those who sacrificed, and particularly those families who lost loved ones there, I can't begin to understand that part of it. Words of mine would be cheap and tawdry to try to get into that space. But I do believe it was a good cause. I do believe that they went and they fought well and bravely and did as well as we could given a very difficult set of circumstances, as those who did have fought in Vietnam in an earlier generation. You know, all wars aren't pretty, all wars aren't perfect, but the American military and the fighting men and women who go out and do the nation's bidding, we don't get to pick those wars. And if we don't like them, perhaps there are remedies back here in the United States involving elections that we should approach in order to change those people who actually do make those decisions.
Thank you.
Good
Sure.
answer. I want to ask you also, you spoke about this in some of the other interviews that you've done about the Israeli prosecution of the war in Gaza. One of the things I was struck by, a couple of things in your book, noted that you didn't shoot Soleimani out of the sky in a commercial airliner and kill dozens of people along with him. Capturing Baghdadi was done very expertly with minimal loss of life. The care that the U.S. used in many of these cases. Now, obviously, it's a different situation. Gaza is right there on the Israeli border. It's not thousands of miles away. But it's also an enclave full of 2 million essentially helpless people who have nowhere else to go. Is the way Israel has been prosecuting this war justifiable, moral? Is it according to the laws of war? Would you have advised the Israelis to go about this differently?
So the law of war recognizes that innocent people are inevitably going to die. The law of war doesn't seek to prevent that loss of life. It recognizes that that loss of life is going to occur. And so the task on a commander and on someone waging a war is what you're doing proportionate to the loss of life that you're causing. And that depends on the nature of the objective that you're going after. So I would argue that, on the other hand, what is explicitly against the law of armed conflict is to embed yourself in a civil population and to use them as human shields. So what Hamas has done from the beginning is expertly dig in among the population of Gaza so that any time Israelis want to strike something, they're on the horns of a dilemma. Hamas leaders are surrounded by people. That's a decision the Israelis have made. They've made their own proportionality calculations. Ours might be different. Ours might not be different. But let's be clear about, so the raid on Baghdadi, I chose not to strike the target because there were 14 children there. He was in the middle of the desert in a mud-walled little compound.
I know, it was easier.
So
it was much easier.
Much more easy. So if you look at, so people who say, well, why don't you go in with special forces raids? Yeah. Well, we saw one 2 weeks ago that went okay, except for what happened coming out. But to talk about being able to go in and do it in some kind of a sterile sense is to misappreciate the character of the war that's going on there. It's in an urban environment.
There are other things that are going on. I mean, the lack of food and medicine, the fact that
so let me just finish my thought on this one, please, and I'll let you. So when we think about raids in an urban environment, we should think about Mogadishu in 1993, where we sent a highly trained special operations force in, and it turned into an ugly, bloody battle where 2 soldiers won the Medal of Honor, received the Medal of Honor for that. So it's very difficult fighting in this environment. It is an urban environment that has been prepared for many years by Hamas for this fight.
Yeah, and in terms of the other aspects of the way the war is being conducted, the fact that there are thousands of children that are starving to death and people are dying of. I talked to someone the other day who'd been in the region and said that people who have very minor wounds, the wounds are not healing and they're dying because they don't have the adequate medical attention and they're living in squalid tents in impossible situation. Isn't that a violation of the laws of war? And, I just, what do you think of it as a human being?
I think first of all, I think it's a tragedy. It's a great tragedy. It's a tragedy that actually began, though, with the attack on Israel by Hamas on 7 October. There's no moral, if you're asking for moral equivalency from me on this, you're not going to get it because I don't believe they're morally equivalent.
All right. Let's see if somebody has better luck. Yes, go for it.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi.
My name is Arash. I'm with Iran International TV. Much has been said about General Qassem Soleimani's capabilities beyond Iran borders, but I'd like to ask you about his role in domestic oppression in Iran. Before he was targeted by U.S. forces, we were receiving reports from Iran where Quds Force or some of the Iranian-funded militia groups in Iraq and in Lebanon were in Iran suppressing Iranian protesters, killing Iranian students. In one case, actually, there was a mullah who was arrested by the Quds Force, and he claimed to have been tortured for a long time. What was his role and responsibilities in domestic operation, and did that play any role for the United States to take him out? Thank you.
So I can answer, no, it did not. However, I don't have any doubt believing he was active in that role, because we know that the IRGC is active in defense of the regime inside Iran. So I wouldn't have any trouble, I wouldn't disagree with your assertions about that. But no, the fact what he did in Iran, we struck him because he was a clear and present danger to Americans. And that was the reason he was struck. No, not because of any other calculation involving what he might have done in Iran.
Here's a question that we're getting online. We have a large online audience. This is from someone who, Richard Buchanan, U.S. Navy. Please describe the attributes you believe should exist in a candidate to be the American Commander-in-Chief.
So I'll tell you this. For a retired four-star general, I made a vow that I won't get into political discussions like that. So I'm not going to be able to deal with that. I will say this. We all benefit when generals, active and retired, stay out of politics and avoid political commentary. That's one small gift I can give the American people.
All right. That's wonderful. One other here that's interesting. This is from a PhD student at the University of Warwick, Matthew Kennedy. How has China impacted the Middle Eastern operational environment, if at all?
The operational environment, not significantly yet. It's coming. They have a base in Djibouti. There's negotiations on potential other bases. I would say to date, they're gathering intelligence. They're looking at it. They're sailing under our security. It's primarily an economic issue for the Chinese. It's coming, though. A significant fraction of China's hydrocarbons go through the Strait of Hormuz. So it's in the future, but not significantly to date.
Question also about the operation against the Houthis, Operation Prosperity Guardian. I believe of our CENTCOM colleagues, only Bahrain, where of course our fleet is located, has joined it. Are you disappointed that the Saudis, who have been building all kinds of fancy ships and so on, didn't join Operation Prosperity Guardian, or the UAE? So
as you know, both the Saudis and the Emiratis fought bloody, drawn wars with the Houthis over the past few years. So yes, I would prefer that they be in it. We've chosen to actually go there, and to act against the Houthis, not because of anything related to the war in Gaza, but rather because of the principle of free passage at sea. And we have not done a particularly good job so far of preventing the Houthis from continuing to close the Bab el-Mandeb. That's a problem that needs to be confronted. The sooner it's confronted, and confronted aggressively, the better for everyone.
Yeah, again, if we're going to have a defense treaty with a country like Saudi Arabia, and they won't even participate in this kind of operation, which is in everyone's interests, what's the point of having a treaty with a country like that? Yes, go. Wait for the microphone.
Hi, my name's Scott McCann. I'm with the John Quincy Adams Society. Returning to the issue with the Palestinians in Gaza, you stated explicitly in your experience that the U.S. is considered a trusted broker in the region. With our undeniable support for Israel throughout this process, do you think that is still the case? And do you think that the undeniable support for Israel has damaged the ability for the United States to act as a trusted broker and advance American interests in the region?
Nations in the region view their primary threat as Iran. To counter Iran, they need the United States, and they need a relationship with Israel. So I do not believe it has substantially damaged those core interests. And remember, there's a difference between what's going on in the Arab street and what decision makers are deciding at the apex of power. It's very different. But I would say I don't believe it has fundamentally changed that at all.
Yeah, it seems to me we get the worst of all worlds because the countries in the, I mean, as the questioner indicated, the populations in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, blame the United States for supporting Israel. It is hurting our image in much of the world and the global South because of our support for Israel. And, you know, I'm just trying to understand where the benefit comes for our national interests if we find it increasingly difficult to, you know, if we're competing with China, which has taken a very different position on the war in Gaza and that sort of thing. Yes, these governments value us, but are we in danger of losing large populations around the world because of our, whatever Israel does, we support them?
Well, I think sometimes a nation has to make a difficult decision. We had to make one after the horrific attack on Israel that occurred on 7 October. I'm very comfortable with the U.S. support that's occurred since then. I believe nations in the region, given a choice, would rather align and cooperate with the United States than China. Yeah. They would rather buy United States military equipment than Chinese military equipment because of the immense qualitative difference in that equipment. Still, and then for the foreseeable future. So I acknowledge the point you're making, but I think it'll pass.
Okay. Yes. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your service, General. Rahim Rashidi with Kurdistan TV. How would you describe the Peshmerga role in fight against ISIS and terrorism in Iraq and in Kurdistan? Second question is, how important is it for the U.S. to provide air defense systems to the Peshmerga? Thank you.
Yeah. So I will tell you that my primary experience is using Kurdish elements up and down the Euphrates River Valley in eastern Syria. And I would say their continued presence there and our continued relationship with them is actually vital to continued pressure on ISIS. And I would extend that into northern Iraq as well, so I would also go there with it. In terms of air defense systems, you're going to have to be more specific if you want me to talk about that as to what you're talking about. What specific, against what threat are you describing? She's coming with a microphone.
Against the Iranian threat.
Yeah. As you know, Kurdistan is your loyal ally on the Middle East. And under attack by drones, by militia, by missile attacks, and now Congress passed a law to provide this system to Kurdistan. How is important you protect your ally and stay with your ally on the region.
Got it. I understand. I certainly think we want to ensure that the Pesh have the ability to protect themselves against ISIS attacks and violent extremist attacks in every way that we can do that. I would certainly support that. Yes.
Gentleman all the way in the back. Yeah. Right for the mic.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti. I'm a retired international executive for ComSat, IBM, VeriSign, and you have metaphorically sort of stepped up to the edge of the swimming pool, and I'm going to ask you to dive right in on a key question. For decades, there's been an element in American political community that encourages a massive U.S. withdrawal of its military presence around the world. And in the past decade, there's been another element which says the United States needs to reset and focus on the Pacific and effectively make an east of Suez type announcement and say to the region, good luck, bye-bye, we wish you well. What you don't often get is someone who knows what they're talking about predicting what would happen if something like that were to occur in some future American government. So I know it's impossible to predict with precision, but what would happen if the United States did in the CENTCOM area what the British did in the 1950s and wish everybody well? And what could you trace for us what happens then?
Sure. Great question. First of all, thanks for asking it. I just begin by saying, like, I agree that the pacing threat for the United States needs to be China. We need to understand that China poses potentially an existential threat to us, maybe not this year or next year, but certainly in the long term, and we need to know and understand how to compete with and defeat China if necessary, globally, not just in the Western Pacific. So we are a global power, and we don't have the luxury of just considering one part of the world. So I think it's a mistake when you think of China just to think of China in the Western Pacific. I talked a little while earlier about China gets a lot of their hydrocarbons through the Strait of Hormuz. If we got into a struggle with China, might it not be better to prevent those hydrocarbons from going through the Strait of Hormuz rather than the Strait of Malacca, as an example, where there's going to be a lot less Chinese combat power that's going to be able to get out to the Middle East. That's just one example, but there are many others. So look, I'm an internationalist. I don't apologize for that. I believe the United States needs to be active abroad, ranging from NATO, the most successful defensive alliance really in history that I'm aware of, to what we're doing in the Western Pacific and what we're doing in the Middle East. By and large, we remain the nation that people want to ally with. People view us and the promises. We don't keep all our promises, but we're still a nation that they want to align with. If we were to pull out of the Middle East as an example, I believe that you'd see return to violent warfare. I think it would be a much more violent place if the United States left. You can take another view. The competing view would be, well, they're fighting because you're there. Actually, I'm not sure of that. We may be a target for some of them, but I don't think the root cause of violence in the Middle East is the presence of the United States in the region. I think that's a gross oversimplification of the problem. People around the world want the United States to be an honest broker. They value the capabilities that we bring. And as we were talking earlier, look, our values might not always align everywhere in the world. But if you are going to take a global perspective, you sometimes have to sit down with people that you share interests with, but not necessarily the same values. If you can't do that, then you're not going to be able to be a global power. And you do need to come home. The problem with coming home is the world is now much smaller. It was small enough in the isolationists leading up to the Second World War when we still had vast oceans on each side of us now. Well, those oceans don't mean much anymore. And cyber, the global topology is radically different. Everywhere is everywhere. So it is a very different situation now. I would argue that we don't have the luxury of coming home. As fascinating as it might be, I don't know that it would be cheaper in the long run if we did that, because not everyone has the American view of we're finished, we're coming home. There are actually aggressive, unbalanced people out there. I would look no further than the leader of Russia, who might continue to press in that case. So, great question, a lot of ways to answer it. I could keep going, but I'll stop right there to say thanks for asking that question. That was a good question. Thank you.
We have only a couple more minutes left. I wanted to get to the issue of the Iranian nuclear program very quickly, if I may. I had the great fortune to meet General McKenzie in Tampa, where there was an excellent conference on Iran. We talked a lot about the nuclear issue. And I thought your comments there were worth repeating. I believe you said that the only thing that would make Iran actually develop a bomb is if we bombed Iran's nuclear facilities.
Well, I think Iran, let's go back to, I said, I think the crown jewels of Iran remain its remarkable conventional capabilities and its missiles, its drones, land attack cruise missiles. That's the crown jewels. Iran likes the idea of being able to have a nuclear weapon. They want to be there flirting at breakout, right at breakout, a week away, 2 weeks away. And look, the Iranians are so ramshackle in their command and control, they could inadvertently achieve breakout, even if the Supreme Leader said not do it. So we shouldn't, no kidding, look at the number of attacks that have occurred in the region by low-level commanders who decided to take Iranian national policy into their own hands. So, but what the Iranians get from flirting with breakout is they can talk to us about sanctions relief. They can talk to the Europeans about sanctions relief. They can get people excited here in the United States. They can do a variety of things. Once you cross the Rubicon, you've lost it. Now you're firmly on the other side of it, and you can't go back. They're not going to let you go back once you do that. So I think that is where they want to be right now. But the other half of the problem is this. Look, so you get breakout. Now you've got a weapon that's about the size of this stage we're on right now, which is not deliverable to Tel Aviv in any reasonable way. You got to build an airframe that'll get it there. You got to build a warhead that'll get it there at theater depth, survive entry into the atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the nuclear weapon is not as much a problem as the aeronautical engineering problem is for them right now. Maybe they could get the weapon somewhere else. I don't discount that. That's certainly possible. But I think right now, and so what I looked for very carefully in the wake of the back and forth with Israel in April was whether, the Iranians going to make a move then. They've talked about it a little bit, but really, no, not yet anyway. So I think they want to be right where they are for the moment. Could change. When President Raisi dying had nothing to do with it. He was an executor, not a policy guy particularly. In the spring, you might see a change if you get a new Supreme Leader. The Supreme Leader's old. He's in his mid-late 80s, but he's been sick for a long time. He could be sick for a long time into the future too. So that would be an opportunity perhaps for change. But I watched very closely, and I just didn't see a change in Iranian policy. So I don't actually, if they wanted to have a nuclear weapon, they could have crossed that boundary long before now.
Should the U.S. bomb them to prevent them from having a nuclear weapon, or is it not necessary because they're just going to stay on the threshold?
So look, I first examined the problem of what you do against Iranian nuclear weapons back in 2010. There's probably not many people in the world that know more about it than I do. It's a difficult proposition to talk about doing that. It's a very difficult proposition.
Even even then.
But it just depends on how much effort you want to put against it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I recall your comments were a little bit different in Tampa.
Well, no. So I said if you were to strike the Iranian nuclear capability, then I think it would change world opinion, and it's possible that someone else might give them a bomb in that case. So yeah, I think there's a greater chance of the Iranians maybe getting to a nuclear weapon if they were struck out of the blue against their nuclear program. So no, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that's what you're asking. Yeah, so there are ways that you could clumsily handle the Iranian nuclear program that would actually give them approval from other nations to move rapidly to possessing a weapon. Yes.
I appreciate that. Well, on that note, I'm afraid we are out of time. So I believe there are books which the General will be signing, and I recommend them. They're a very good read. And I want to thank you very much. I hope I haven't tormented you too much, but it's been a lot of fun.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks. That's great. Thank you.
Sorry.
It's okay.